I'm Marty Downs. I'm the director of the LTER Network Office, and we're supporting the LTER Graduate Student Committee in developing this visual media series. And I am going to hand it off to Cassandra Miller from the Sevietta LTER to introduce our speaker and kick us off. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Marty. Good morning to everybody and good afternoon, especially to those of us joining us today from across the different coasts. I'm so excited to welcome you to the inaugural session of the new LTER Visual Media Webinar Series. Like Marty said, I'm Cassandra, a PhD student at the Sevietta LTER in South Central New Mexico, and I have the honor of introducing today's speaker. Before we dive into the exciting world of science communication through graphic design, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the incredible efforts of the LTER Graduate Student Committee, especially the Events and Initiatives Committee, which are some of us who are showing our faces today, along with support from the LTER Network Office in making this series possible. We hope that this webinar series inspires you and helps foster a community of aspiring scientists passionate about conveying their research effectively. Now, without further ado, let's turn our attention to our esteemed speaker, Jen Christiansen. Jen is a luminary in the fields of graphic design, science communication, and data visualization. She masterly creates captivating and informative scientific illustrations that communicate complex scientific concepts seen through the publications such as the Scientific American, where she's been a senior graphics editor for about 8 years, and National Geographic, and more. With Jen's keen eye, she's been instrumental in developing images that engage, inform, and inspire both specialists and non-specialists alike. Right now, she says she's working on one about the 25th anniversary of dark energy and dark matter, which is the concept I clearly know nothing about as an ecologist. But I'm excited and looking forward to that publication. In addition to her body of graphic designs, Jen has continuously found ways to share her knowledge and her expertise, most recently by authoring a book, Building Science Graphics, which she published last year. I encourage anyone who is inspired after today's lecture to check out this valuable resource. And now, please help me extend a warm virtual welcome to Jen as she kicks off our series. We're so excited to have you with us this morning.
Great. Thanks so much for that introduction, excuse me, and thanks for having me. I'm really excited that you all are excited enough about this topic to host a whole webinar series, and it's a real honor to be a part of it. So let's see, I'm going to start my screen record. I have a monitor over here, so I'm going to look to the side for a moment, but I'm going to get my slides going. So basically, I'm going to talk for about 40-45 minutes, and then we can have a Q&A. Let's see. So you should be seeing a gray screen, hopefully.
I should just interject there that the Q&A, we're going to do the Q&A in the Q&A tool in the webinar. So you can add your questions at any time throughout Jen's talk, and then she'll address them at the end. So if a question comes up while she's speaking, you don't have to remember it. You can just put it in the Q&A, and others can also upvote those. And then we'll come back around to it. And yes, we will share the link to the book in the chat.
Great. Thanks, Marty. While you're there too, can you see my slide okay? My first slide?
Yes, we can.
Excellent. Great. Okay. So as I mentioned, I'm going to start with a little bit of a talk. I'll start with some context so you can better understand my point of view. And then I'm going to jump into some definitions and background information about science graphics. I'll touch upon how graphics fit into the practice of science communication. And then I'm going to pass along my top tips for designing them. Again, that should take about 40 to 45 minutes, and then we can have a conversation. I should note that the design tips section won't include design fundamentals like color and typography specifics, mostly since I think those sorts of concepts are best absorbed while you're actively working on a project. And those design fundamentals are available in a wide range of resources, ranging from free online content to references like my book, Building Science Graphics. So rather, I'm going to step back and provide some concepts that are particularly helpful when it comes to creating visuals in the service of science communication, mostly because I think those are concepts that are useful to everyone, regardless of your previous design training. So for more on design basics and a deeper dive on what I'll be sharing today, you can check out my book. And on this webpage, I have a clickable list of additional resources, many of which are freely available online. So if you just want to see and kind of peruse and browse some different topics without necessarily buying the full book, you can kind of see what kinds of information informed it and get a hold of some free resources too. So for some context, here's a bit about me so you can better understand what has informed my point of view. I was trained primarily in traditional or physical media. Here's one of my first public scientific illustrations. These are ink drawings of hydrothermal vent shrimp mouthparts. It was one of the products of a few summers in college working in a crustacea lab at the Natural History Museum in Los Angeles. I started using digital media in the late 1980s with the Commodore Amiga in high school, and that dates me a bit. But then I shifted over to tablets and virtual drawing using a stylus in college. I double majored in geology and studio art at Smith College in Massachusetts. And at the time, dedicated data visualization classes weren't an option. But I picked up some very rudimentary Excel skills in geology classes. These are not my best work, but they definitely served their purpose. A scientific illustration graduate program at the University of California, Santa Cruz caught my eye and allowed me to officially merge my interests in art and science in a more formal way. It's now hosted by California State University at Monterey Bay. So that program set me on a path to Scientific American magazine, where I've spent the majority of my career in two discrete intervals, the first in the mid to late 90s, and then again from 2007 until today. Between those two intervals, I was an art director and then a designer at National Geographic magazine, and I spent about 4 years as a science communication freelancer. So today there are two of us full-time on the staff of the graphics team at Scientific American, Amanda Montanez and me. And we art direct all of the information graphics in the magazine, from data visualizations like this sample by Shirley Wu to illustrated explanatory diagrams like this sample by Sherry Sinnen, and everything in between, like this example by Nick Bockelman that includes some elements that could be considered data visualization and other elements that are more along the lines of a schematic or a diagram. So sometimes we develop the final images ourselves, but most often Amanda and I hire freelance artists and manage the project. Okay, so what are science graphics? Let's start with graphics, which I generally use as shorthand for information graphics. By my definition, information graphics are illustrations built on a foundation of research that exist primarily to convey information. For example, here's an information graphic from the pages of Scientific American. The team at Brian Christie Design, which is an art studio, use visual symbols to convey very specific information that is rooted in research. In this case, the goal is twofold. One, show that a variety of different known microbe types reside within a very specific parts of the human body. And two, show how one of the more thoroughly understood microbes interacts with the body. So for the title pages of that same article, they developed an image that's not a literal representation of the concept, but instead nods to the idea of a human as being defined by the microbes within. So this is an editorial illustration. It's a metaphorical image that represents the theme of the text, with a primary purpose of engaging readers and priming them for the content that follows. So I tend to think of information graphics as a continuum with figurative representations on one end and abstract representations on the other. In the world of science, you could argue that that full continuum can also be referred to as data visualizations. After all, essentially all of our work is rooted in data collection at some stage in the process, from bone length measurements in dinosaur reconstructions to meticulously documented laboratory experiments that build up to a more complete understanding of processes like photosynthesis, to representations of mathematical expressions like Feynman diagrams, to straight up plotting of the raw data itself in chart form. But it's probably more useful in most cases to think of the continuum like this, with representative illustrations at one end, data visualizations on the other, and illustrated explanatory diagrams in the middle. So today I'll mostly be focusing on this portion of the continuum, illustrated explanatory diagrams and data visualizations. Okay, so how do science graphics fit into the practice of science communication? Well, science communication encompasses a wide range of traditions and frameworks that vary across discipline, time, and space. So at its broadest level, it generally refers to the idea of sharing information or building knowledge with others that is rooted in the practice or findings of science. At a more granular level, it becomes complicated by who is or who should be participants in specific exchanges, the roles of those participants, and the goals of those exchanges. So it's really tempting to proclaim that visual languages are more universal than spoken and written languages, and that the very act of presenting information in the form of a drawing instead of words makes it more accessible. But that's not necessarily the case. Visual jargon, just as an example, is just as prevalent as written jargon. Symbols that carry highly specific information within a specific context can be a really efficient way to communicate with others who are fluent in that language, like a peer group of scientists. But they simultaneously act like a brick wall to outsiders or people who just aren't familiar with that language. That said, there's generally a low initial barrier to entry when faced with an image. So color, form, and composition can trigger a reaction from the viewer without significant conscious effort. So there's a perception researcher by the name of Colin Ware, who has written several books that I highly recommend. He wrote that, quote, visual media can support the perception of almost instantaneous scene gist, rapid explorations of spatial structure and relationships between objects, as well as emotions and motivations. So this ability to communicate quickly before asking too much of the audience is a powerful thing when you're vying for eyeballs, especially if you prescribe to the idea of people's attention as being a limited resource. In science communication, a wide range of image types serve the purpose of engagement. So photographs, editorial illustrations, fine art, and graphics all have the potential to quickly capture the attention of people in different ways. But to my mind, science graphics are uniquely positioned as visual aids that have the power to both beckon people in and to provide concrete information to influence the conversations that follow. So at its best, engagement is followed by learning, which then leads to continued engagement, all within the same frame. For example, you might be familiar with the warming stripes graphics, like this one from Ed Hawkins. They are a nod to our warming planet. No labels or captions are needed in order to get the gist that the stripe pattern is showing a progression of something from a cool blue to a hot red. So this pattern reproduces legibly on everything from social media profiles to neckties, magazine covers, mugs, and even concert screens. Just as critically, the charts live within a spare, dedicated website. So that site has easily shareable and downloadable charts from many different locations around the world. And it includes a clear and friendly invitation to use the charts for any purpose, copyright free. All of those boxes can't be ticked for all science graphics, and nor should they be. It all depends on the goal of the chart. But I do love this as an inspiring example of a chart about an important topic that was designed to be shared widely in unconventional ways. And it's a super reminder that sometimes graphics can and should be a conversation starter, as opposed to a fully labeled out and annotated object to be read. Okay, let's move on to style. So before you can even begin to communicate a science topic to another person, you have to first be able to engage that person. So the research literature is a little thin on this topic when it comes to illustrated graphics, less so with data visualization, where there's been a lot more perception research done. That said, some studies provide support for the general strategies that I'll outline in just a moment. For example, researcher Emma Schlettma and her collaborators found that both medical professionals and patients preferred realistic, detailed, and dimensional illustrations over streamlined and abstract drawings. Quote, patient participants tended to associate realistic, colorized, and shaded representations with both a greater quantity of information and a more credible source of information. The patients often favored illustrations that depicted a greater amount of information than the professionals suggested was necessary, end quote. So in my experience, if a graphic does not incorporate kind of immediately visible context, a familiar visual vocabulary, or a welcoming gesture for the non-specialist reader, it may simply confirm a preconception that the content itself is abstract and unrelatable, thereby shutting down the opportunity to convey that information to a new audience. How this translates into practice depends upon your audience and the context for your graphic. So here are some examples to show you what I mean. Strategy 1 is to provide immediately visible context. So this image is a schematic that shows expansion of some sort, but without a title, caption, labels, or additional context, it's not very clear that it's a graphic about the universe. Now, this image addresses the same topic, but visible figurative context is added. The casual reader now has a better sense of place. This is a graphic about the cosmos. Now, there's something intellectually and aesthetically appealing about the graphic on the left, but the immediately visible context in the graphic on the right, in the form of tiny galaxy illustrations, helps set the scene. Readers can picture themselves on a planet on one of those tiny galaxies in an expanding universe. Now, I should nod to audience for these kinds of things as well. The graphic on the right might not be the best way to go for a journal or a kind of an audience of peers. In that case, maybe the graphic on the left is a better way to go, particularly if you want to nod to specific numbers. Strategy 2 is to use a familiar visual vocabulary. Again, this is really good for non-specialist audiences. For an article on artificial photosynthesis, we started with a really familiar visual vocabulary on the left. It includes imagery and symbols that a lot of people might remember from their high school textbooks in the chapter on photosynthesis. Then we used that same visual language to describe the new technology on the right, silicon nanowires that can produce energy in the form of hydrogen. Strategy 3 is to include welcoming gestures. So illustrative details can help make an abstract topic more relatable. For example, a small drawing of the subject matter or the use of a visual metaphor can provide immediate context when used next to a less figurative chart. Here, for example, an illustrated rubber band experiment helps to set up the reader to understand the cosmic expansion charts on the right. So 2 snapshots are shown of a rubber band pulled upward at a certain rate. The velocity of different points marked on the band is given by the length of the color-coded arrows. Those color-coded arrows correspond with the arrows in the first chart, helping a non-specialist reader make the leap from real-life example to the larger concept. Okay, so let's move on to some tips for designing graphics. Tip number 1 is to be strategic. Building a graphic can be time and cost intensive, so be realistic when it comes to budget, deadlines, and scope. Before diving into a project, ask this guiding question. Would a graphic be useful in helping to convey the information at hand? Well, when is a graphic useful? To my mind, a graphic might be useful if an image can tell the story more efficiently, effectively, or completely than words, like the iconic Feynman diagrams, in which a visual can stand in for a more abstract formula. Or if the narrative involves complex and intertwining relationships, and an image map can help the reader track connections, like a process diagram that explains photosynthesis. Or if the reader might benefit from seeing and exploring trends and patterns of the complete data set, rather than being served up a few key numbers in the text. Or when a direct and immediate visual comparison is useful in highlighting change or differences between states, such as competing hypotheses or before and after views. So I'm not a fan of just kind of deciding to build a graphic because there's room or time or money to spare. And people like the idea of filling it with a kind of a snazzy visual to engage people. Now, engagement is a very honorable goal. But if that's your only goal, I'd encourage you to consider if a representative illustration, like a straight up drawing of an object, an editorial illustration, like a metaphorical piece of art that is evocative in nature, or if a photograph might be a more fitting solution. Okay, tip number 2 is to articulate the goal of your graphic before you even start drawing. Write down the goal of your graphic. What is the point of the image? Keep it short and succinct, ideally 1 to 3 sentences. So that stated goal is your touchstone. Keep coming back to it to make sure that your graphic doesn't spiral out of scope. It's also a handy statement to have when communicating with collaborators about the project. It can help ensure that your intentions are aligned, and it can help keep critiques focused on the intended point of the graphic. So here are a few goal statements that I've used to guide graphics in the past. Here's one: is separate out the entwined concepts of dark energy, the cosmological constant, and vacuum energy, illustrating each and showing how they are connected. This is the graphic that emerged from that goal statement, designed by Federica Fragapane. And here's a closer look at a few details. Here's another goal statement example. So introduce people to the idea of percolation theory. A simple mesh network example demonstrates that in order for any 2 phones to communicate, they need to be linked by a chain of other phones. And here's how that graphic played out online when we could use an animated GIF. So there's no caption and labels here because it was kind of the context was provided in the text. So you'd read a paragraph of text and then hit this example immediately after. And here's one more for an illustration I showed earlier. This goal statement was, show how an artificial leaf made of silicon nanowires works. In a process similar to photosynthesis in natural leaves, it transforms photons into storable, transportable fuel. And here you can see that artist Sherry Sinin honored the goal statement by showing not only how an artificial leaf works, but also how it compares to natural photosynthesis. Okay, tip number 3 is to keep context in mind. Now, content is usually pretty clear. That's the information to be visualized as articulated in your goal statement. That context is equally important, but it's often kind of neglected at the start of a project. What tools will be used to make the graphic? Where will it appear? Who is the audience? And what's the designer's relationship to that audience? And when does it need to be completed? All of those factors shape decisions related to what pieces of the content are critical to include and how it should be presented. So some of those factors are more regimented than others. For example, the destination for your graphic might dictate the size and the format. Like a journal might provide you with very clear dimensions and file type instructions. Other variables, like the intended audience and accessibility measures, are more complex and less prescriptive. I recommend consciously describing and, again, even writing down the key variables about the context, including where will your image live? The answer to this question will inform decisions related to both content and style, as well as the dimensions of your graphic, and therefore kind of the composition or how you organize the elements on the page. It also informs the level of detail that might be appropriate. For example, here's a graphic that I love. It's called the Swiss Cheese Pandemic Defense Graphic by Ian M. McKay. It's totally suitable for viewing on a laptop screen or a computer monitor and in print. But I'm guessing that you're having a hard time seeing and digesting the details in this spoken word presentation. So the title, subhead, and labels are critical for a standalone graphic. But combined, those details make this graphic kind of pretty dense with information. And it might be hard for you to be reading this while also listening to a speaker or while reading closed captions. So for a live presentation, many of those illegible details can be removed. The speaker will be providing the broader context with their voice or via closed captioning. So the graphic doesn't need to be completely self-explanatory in a slideshow format. So the best solution depends on the points that the speaker would like to highlight, but perhaps even something as stripped down as this could make sense. Now, true, some slide decks do need to operate on a few levels, since they're often circulated as a proxy for the live presentation. In those cases, leaving all of the text in place might make sense, as not everyone will have the benefit of a speaker walking them through the content. But if you're optimizing your content for a live audience, reducing density is a good idea. If you'd like the best of both worlds, you could keep the slide less dense and include a link to the original fully detailed graphic in the notes. If it is important to highlight all of the visible details in the original graphic, consider a series of static slides that help guide your reader's attention through the graphic and labels in kind of a very focused and intentional way, like this. So I could be talking about masks now, and then move on to hand hygiene and cough etiquette, etc. So you might be thinking that that wasn't a very big change for a different context. And you're right, it didn't take very long to execute. But what if your original graphic is like a flat bitmap file? So it's a file that you can't move the objects around in, or you can't like easily take an object and delete it or remove some text independent of the other bits of text around it. So for the case of slides or social media posts, you could consider simply cropping in or highlighting details of your original graphic. In this case, I recommend reducing the contrast of the portions that are outside of the area of interest. This kind of helps focus attention and reduces visual noise. And then you're kind of like acting as though you have a spotlight on where you want people to focus. And then you can shift focus to another section of the graphic when you're speaking about that part. So it's really important to think about where and how your imagery will be presented, and then think through solutions that will help optimize your image for that specific setting. Okay, so other questions you should ask yourself. Who is the target audience, and what is your or your publication's relationship with that audience? So for example, for an article on quantum mechanics and bird navigation, the scientist authors provided us with a super reference diagram, this one. So the key information is all represented here, but it's not very clear unless you already know a bit about the topic. It's optimized for their peers, an expert audience. Ultimately, the story team at Scientific American translated some of the jargon and provided more context for a non-specialist audience with the captions. And then we also made the decision to add bird drawings. These are done by Jillian Dittner. And that helped connect the abstract process to the big picture for a non-specialist audience. So what's going on in kind of this quantum realm below sort of influences this thing that they can relate to, bird moving through space and changing its direction. Okay, so given the outlet and the audience, what tone or vibe feels appropriate? The answer to this question, along with the subject matter, will inform decisions related to rendering style and illustrative details. So that's demonstrated here by a pair of graphics that both show an exoplanet passing in front of a star. So a coloring book for kids, like the sample on the left here, might exclude some technical details and jargon and be rendered in a more playful style than a graphic on the same topic for the adults, like the one on the right. And this wonderfully quirky graphic by Mona Chalabi for The Guardian is really well suited to engage general readers with a topic, but probably isn't a great match for an academic journal. So after putting some thought into your context, which can also be thought of as the final outlet and target audience, revisit your goal statement to make sure that the content you hope to convey still feels suitable. And tip 4 is to remember that building a graphic is a process. You can't expect graphics to just kind of emerge fully formed right before the deadline in a single go, as much as I would love that be the case sometimes. But with some forethought and structure, you can set up your graphics building process to dovetail with the stages of your larger project, so that graphics can be properly reviewed by other people in context. So I recommend starting out with a lot of fast, kind of low-risk doodles, experimenting with different ways to organize the information. There's something really freeing about just taking a pencil to paper and just scribbling out ideas. Pencil sketches are fast, foster an exploratory mentality, and are low risk. Then after you've narrowed in on a solution that you're happy with, you can shift from exploration mode into presentation mode and make things more intelligible for your collaborators. At this point, I find it helpful to break the process up into 3 formal segments. I call it concept sketch, tight sketch, and final graphic. Consider dovetailing those steps with other deadlines of your project, such as text revision and editing deadlines. For me at the magazine, I have these aligned with my text editor deadlines, so that when a new draft of the text comes in, there's an updated sketch to be reviewed alongside it. That allows everybody who's reviewing it to just kind of digest everything together at once, and you're not kind of peppering them with lots of different kinds of details about the same story over the course of a week, when they can just kind of on that one day just kind of digest it all. So for your concept sketch, create a frame that matches the absolute dimensions of your final product. Use your doodles as a guide and transcribe that information into the larger frame. Include preliminary captions or just kind of placeholder text. I often just use kind of Latin dummy text, so that you kind of remember to actively design them into the space, and that you're considering how they'll relate to the imagery from the start. Now, sometimes your context, so if the ultimate context here is a journal article, sometimes your hands are tied on some of these fronts and you can't add a lot of captioning within the frame of the graphic. And if that's the case, though, I recommend when you're drawing your graphic to leave space for the caption at the top or at the bottom, just as they would. So you're kind of thinking about how the imagery that you're working on and the text, even if it's not embedded inside of it, how that kind of accompanying text will relate to your visuals. So send that concept sketch out for review by your collaborators with specific questions related to what type of feedback you're hoping for at each stage. So for example, at this concept sketch stage, I'm most interested in making sure that I'm getting the big picture right, and that people understand the intended flow of information. There's no need to focus on aesthetics at this stage from my point of view. And then I want feedback to focus on whether the information and the path through that information is clear, useful, and accurate. So if the feedback from collaborators on the concept sketch is relatively minor and pertains to details within that larger plan, I then move on to the tight sketch. Here I'm starting to correct errors and sharpen the details. At this stage, I also folded in Sherry Sinnen. So I did the concept sketch here, and then I hired the artist Sherry Sinnen to take that concept sketch along with some notes and the feedback that I received, and then to incorporate those into a tight sketch in her own style. If you're responsible for writing the captions, refine them now too. So if somebody else will be writing them, this is a good time to just check in and ask for updated text. Pay special attention to text and label position and the developing rendering style at this stage. So for the final graphic, correct any remaining errors and finalize the rendering style, including color. Are the labels legible? Think about that sort of thing. Refine leader lines and double check alignments just to kind of make everything click in and feel aesthetically pleasing. So by working through these stages with concept sketches that start out as broad stroke kind of composition guides that are deeply rooted in the content, I find I'm forced to really think through the content before I get distracted by drawing details. I kind of resist the temptation to just paste corrections like over the existing composition. Sometimes you need to backtrack to the concept sketch. So try to keep it from moving too far along through the process before something gets flagged as actually, this isn't very clear. Because if you just kind of paste in corrections, often things start to sort of devolve a little bit and the original intention sort of dissipates. So tip 5 is to clarify, don't simplify. So more often than not, scientific content is complex and the research papers that describe it can be dense. So if you try to strip away that complexity for a general audience, you're at risk of either kind of producing an oversimplified primer graphic that doesn't really present the latest findings, or a graphic that shows the latest discovery without proper context for people who are new to the topic. I find it more kind of productive to think about clarifying, not simplifying. That's not a unique framing. Designers including Nigel Holmes and Alberto Cairo have articulated it before. So with an eye to clarity, you become a translator or a guide. The focus shifts away from watering the information down and turns towards knocking down barriers of entry and beckoning the reader in. The goal is to make complex and specialized information accessible to your audience. So that's particularly critical when developing a graphic for a broad audience. But I think it's also a really helpful mindset when creating graphics for content area experts too, as it can prevent you from kind of falling back on too many assumptions with regards to your shared language. So here's a few strategies for doing that. Starting with embracing complexity. For a Scientific American article on gene expression in the brain by scientists Ed Lean and Michael Harwilitz, I started with charts that were provided by the authors that were similar to this one. So these charts show how gene expression varies between individuals. Color indicates the extent of the variability. It's a chart or a map style that allows for a cross comparison of brain structures within a chart and between different scenarios, so across more than one of these charts. The originals were designed to communicate results within a peer group, an audience of other neuroscientists that were highly motivated to read and understand the images. They lean on a visual vocabulary of symbols and colors that would be familiar to other neuroscientists. I like to think of it as using, again, that word kind of visual jargon. So jargon can be really useful. Words and imagery that carry highly specific meaning within a specific context can be a really efficient way to, communicate with others within a community. But jargon in both written and drawn forms can be a big obstacle to people who are not fluent in that language. So there are very few, if any, points of entry here for the uninitiated. So sometimes the content you're trying to communicate is complicated like this, and that's okay. Again, the goal isn't to water it down or to oversimplify, it's to clarify. So for the gene expression graphic makeover, I ultimately collaborated with the data designer Jan Willem Tulp to develop something more broadly accessible. So in this case, that did not mean a different chart form. Instead, we stripped away barriers of entry and added welcoming gestures. So we started with the source material, then slowly walked through it, translating one detail at a time into a more broadly understood written and visual language, adding in layers of context for people new to the topic, so that full data set remains intact. Jan Willem simply removed insider conventions like that rainbow color palette and replaced it with a more intuitive and aesthetically pleasing tonal scale. We included a few brain illustrations to help make abstract brain region terms tangible and relatable. So this one's a mouse brain, but on the facing page, there was a human brain that was a little bit more immediately recognizable. And then we explained how to read the graphic in plain language with a leader line that pointed directly towards a referenced spot in the chart. Then we kind of had some fun by energizing the layout. This is a bit of a designer trick by turning the charts 45 degrees and cropping off some of the redundant portions of each plot. Okay, strategy 2 is to annotate the primary source material directly in plain language. So press releases and academic publications often include images that reference a key finding. So very often, though, those images are not optimized for people new to the topic. So this image, for example, is from 2012 when direct evidence of the Higgs boson was announced. So many news outlets ran this kind of pickup imagery as is, but I'm not really sure people knew what they were looking at. Most readers probably didn't understand what they were seeing. But I'm not trying to imply that the people that generated this imagery did anything wrong. It's all about the ultimate audience and goal of the graphic and how you intend to use that kind of imagery. So when I pick up this kind of imagery, I'm trying to think of what is the goal of our graphic and what do we want our readers to get out of it. So with just a little additional work, these kinds of images can be annotated with key points to clarify what's being depicted. So a few labels can go a long way in helping readers make sense of what they're looking at. So here at the this bottom image on the left here is from the source with the addition of 2 photon labels that I've added. And then at the top, we included a schematic of what the scientists were looking for. So now the reader has a little more context. Those green bars in the source material are evidence of particles that were emitted from the Higgs boson inside of this big contraption. So here's a closer look at that pair of images. The hypothesis is on the left, and the observation is on the right. So you can think about how labels or annotations might be able to help a reader focus on the critical takeaways. So if you don't immediately understand a graphic, even if it's beautiful, your audience probably won't either. And that's when labels and annotations can be really useful. Again, so figures in science papers generally rely on visual jargon a lot. So if you're a scientist working up a graphic about your work, or if you're starting with an academic paper as your source material, just kind of pause and think about your audience. You might need to decode some of the visual elements that have been used as shorthand. At the very least, I recommend making sure that you define kind of specialized symbols that you use. As shown here, for example, arrowheads and bars are often used in biology to represent activation and inhibition. It's a really useful shorthand in some contexts, but not great for broad audiences. That's not to say you can't use it, but just maybe add a simple label or annotation to help clarify the meaning. Strategy 3 is to fold background information into the main graphic. So this was for a fun story on Boyagin's star. It's also known as Tabby's star, after the astronomer Tabitha Boyagin, who first noted kind of odd fluctuations in its apparent brightness when viewed from Earth. Even if you don't know it by name, every once in a while, the media kind of picks up on like, oh, there might be alien structures around this star from far away. And yeah, so it gets a little bit of buzz every once in a while. But here's a plot of the light from that star with an overall downward trend punctuated by vertical drop-offs. So for an article on the topic, we decided to create a data visualization to tell one piece of the story. Why is the dimming pattern perplexing? So presenting a graph of perceived light intensity from Tabby's star based on this was a start, but that would only demonstrate the pattern, not explain why it's unusual. So to do that, we needed to represent a more common star dimming situation. So that allows us to then show why the irregular pattern by Tabby's star is weird. So here's the common pattern, and then here's the unusual pattern from Tabby's star. And then we also included labels to help direct attention to the critical parts, an interval of steady dimming, and then a highly variable dip pattern. I think I'm taking a little more time. I want to make sure we leave some time for questions. So I think I'm going to buzz through these last few slides. I also recommend you can include a separate primer box. If there's a concept that comes up over and over again, you can just do a little like glossary-like primer box assisted with a graphic to kind of help set people up to read your other graphics more efficiently later. Yeah, and we did a similar thing here where we just did a primer graphic on how flu replication works, so that we could then present kind of new information stripped down in a way that really focused on the latest bits, and knowing that that primer graphic that we showed earlier would arm people with the information to more fully understand the new part. So that concludes my formal remarks. Here's that resource list again. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and then take some questions here. My monitor's over here, so I'm going to look in this direction and stop my screen share. There we go. Hope you're still with me. I know sometimes when I get talking, I really get going there. Are there any questions or anything?
I'm just going to invite the participants to share questions in the Q&A, or alternatively in the chat if that's easier for you. And the panelists don't have access to the Q&A, so you can just jump in with questions. And also let folks know that once we've completed the Q&A, we're going to move over to a separate meeting to have a little more intimate discussion about the examples that were submitted. And I will share that link in the chat as soon as we get to that point.
People are still digesting information. I threw a lot of info at you.
Yeah. I was really struck by the idea of visual jargon. I thought that was a really nice shorthand for stuff that we know happens, but I sort of haven't been able to identify it in that way. And you're
Yeah, and I think we all have blind spots to that, because often I'll mark something up when I'm sending it out to an expert reviewer or a scientist to ask them for feedback. And they're like, what is FPO? I'm like, oh, that's for position only. Like that's what, like we use it all the time. And so I need to remember to take my own advice often, because you get caught in your own like shorthand. So just take a step back. Yeah. Oh, I do see a question here now. So what advice would you give to scientific illustrators who seek to focus more attention to scientific illustration between projects? How do you see scientists making space for illustration within the scope of research? Well, I know when I was studying sciences, and I know that's a little bit different than doing active research, although it did help me with my honors thesis too, which was, proto research. It was an undergraduate level, but it was still research. I found that using drawing as one of my note-taking strategies, and as my problem-solving strategies, even if I wasn't like doing a graphic for like the thesis, I was working through problems in a way that relied more on imagery. And then also when I was studying for exams and things, I found that drawing things for me helped also lodge that information more in my head. So my notes for classes are filled with all kinds of drawings. And they're not necessarily meant to communicate something to someone later, but they allowed me to practice my skills and serve the function of causing me to think through things more fully and to really pause and observe. So I think just folding in science illustration into your day-to-day stuff, in your lab books, in your field work. Oh my gosh, my field guide, like my field books from classes, like that. And I go back to those. Like, I don't go back and read my notes. I'm like, oh, remember that map I drew at that field site in the Bahamas? Like, where was that? And like, and so I go and use that as like as an object and an artifact to return to also. Let's see, there's another question here. How do you find the artists that bring the sketch to life? What kind of ballpark monetary compensation should we expect to pay? So I find artists through a few different things. I'm always keeping my eyes open. And if I see an illustration I like, I'm looking for the credit, or I'll screenshot it, bring it into Google image search, see if I can find it in a portfolio or whatnot. On social media, if I ever see an image or a portfolio by somebody, I flag it, even if I don't have a need for that particular artist at that moment in time. So I just kind of collect this virtual like Rolodex of artists that are excel in different content areas and different styles. So I'm kind of looking at it for a few different points of view. If anybody at your university has worked with an artist, like ask people, like, have you had good experiences with working with artists? Or if you see a figure, again, look for credits. Compensation is a complicated thing because it's based on a lot of different variables. For example, like pharmaceutical companies pay and are expected to pay much more for some medical illustrations than the magazine world, in part because pharmaceutical companies are raking in a lot of cash for some of that stuff. So there's this sense of, okay, if the company is going to make a lot of money off of this and they need a really slick animation that costs a lot of time and money to render, that's going to be a higher rate than an editorial piece that's we have shorter deadline schedules. We're not necessarily doing a fully animated thing, that it can be done in different styles that are a little faster to do, so the rate will come down a little bit. For active scientists who are looking for somebody to do an illustration for their paper or whatnot, I think there's lots of different bargaining tools you can use to help bring fees down or keep it reasonable for everybody involved. One is, just ask, if you see an artist whose work you like, ask like, how much did that cost, or how much would something like that cost? And if that's out of your budget, just be honest and say, well, I don't have that in my budget. Not that that's not what it's worth, because it's definitely worth that, if not more, but I don't have that in my current budget. This is what I have in my current budget. Is there a style that you could do, or is there a solution that you can think of that would allow you to fairly execute something with this budget? That might mean, instead of a fully 3D, beautifully colored piece, a line drawing might be what your budget can cover. But that line drawing can still be incredibly suitable for the task at hand. Other things are sometimes, like in the editorial world, we sometimes bring fees down a little bit by allowing the artist to retain their copyright. So after like 60 to 90 days after initial publication, they can sell rights to reprint it to anybody they want to also. So then they can use that as like stock imagery. So that's another kind of bargaining tool. Like if you want to buy copyright, that's going to cost you more. So there's things like a deadline schedule. If you have a lot of time, then the fees might differ, but if you have a short period of time, it's going to cost more. So I'm not really giving you numbers because it's kind of hard to do, because also different stages of an artist's career, or if somebody's really busy, they'll be like, no, I can't take that on. And then the pot gets sweet and they might be like, I'll make room for that. But somebody who's starting out, who's like, well, I need to start, I need to make some money this month. So there might be more willing to agree to the lower fee. And the more to explore link, I think I include some places to find artists. The Guild of Natural Science Illustrators is one spot. And they are revamping their website. So I'm hoping it'll be easier to find artists on that site within a few months. But there's portfolios that you can click through there. Yeah.
Thanks, Jen. I wanted to highlight another question. Nicole asks, the examples that you showed were fantastic. What are your recommendations for folks that aren't as artistically skilled, even for the sketching part, but would like to improve their graphic skills?
Yeah, so I'm sorry I didn't really get into composition and color and things. Again, it's because there are a lot of resources that kind of can help with that. Oh, and I'm going to put one in the chat now because it's written specifically for scientists. So if you go, I wrote this out, just I'm glad somebody asked. So I put it in the chat. The Little Book of Design Critique for Scientists. There's also a few other documents there. One is the Little Book of Design for Scientists by Vasilisa Semonchika. And it has some basics. So, but if you think about like of graphics as like positioning objects on a page and not about like drawing things, like so many are, it's like if you think of flow charts and different things, like there's not real like illustration skills going in there. It's about thoughtfully positioning things on a page. So think about like if you were to walk somebody through your graphic and talk them through it, where would you start? Wherever you're starting, think about putting that in the top left corner. If you're doing it for an outlet that's kind of follows the classic Western left to right, top to bottom reading pattern, stop putting things in the top left corner is very handy, like a, hey, start here, and then help make sure people know where to go. You can use arrows, you can use numbers, but just like I find sometimes even if you just literally talk out loud how you want somebody to move through the information you're presenting, and then start to just use shapes to hold the places of those bits of information. And so think about how am I organizing this information so somebody can move through it and gain meaning from it. And then maybe use things like Philopic is a source of free little species illustrations. The Noun Project has little drawings too that you can use. So if you feel like you need some illustrative components, there are some kind of stock imagery options for you too.
Those are great resources. I'm Googling as you're talking. Another question in the chat, as a scientist who wants to be an active part in the communication of science, what level of understanding or participation in understanding do we need to have in the creation of illustrations versus hiring someone? Should we be taking courses on graphic design?
I think every scientist should take some courses in graphic design. No, I think because I think most scientists have had some writing training. But in US schooling, most students get writing training, and you're expected to learn how to write a formal letter, a casual, there's all these different categories of communication, of written words that we're expected to learn, and we're not really taught routinely kind of graphics and design. So I think it's useful when anybody can learn some more of that, because it just like, especially when you think about how visual so much communication is now with social media in particular. And so the more of those skills you can pick up, the more power you yield as a communicator. On the other hand, like science communication, I think, works best when it's a group of people working together. So it's not just coming out of one person's head, because this idea of co-design and working together with the people who have different experiences can really strengthen things and keep us out of these silos. So I don't think it's something everybody needs to excel at. Much like I can write when pressed, but it takes me a really long time. Like writing that book took me a really long time. Now my text writing colleagues could I've learned some of the skills, but I'm also realized how can I be the most effective member of this other team on something. Often that means like having some knowledge, even if you can't do it yourself, is really useful when it comes to critiquing and to kind of help push people to make things better. But I think, whenever you have the opportunity to kind of add another tool to your toolkit, say if you can take it, yeah.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I know we're reaching the hour. I think that's a great note to end on, especially since we're a collaborative network with lots of different fields represented. I think that really resonates, at least with me.
Yeah, I think we are at the top of the hour. There is one more question to answer, and I just want to thank Jen immensely, and then we will, you can actually handle the next phase in one of two ways. We don't have a huge number of people left. There are 23 people left online. I can just promote them all to panelists and it will act like a meeting. And I think that might be the simplest way to move into the discussion of the graphics that we have. I think I'll also stop recording at that point. Yeah. So if you're, if you have to move on to something else, we totally understand. Let's thank Jen. And I think there's a big round of applause going on out there, even though you can't hear it. And if you're able to stay on for the discussion, just hang tight and we'll get that switched over in a sec.